Okay, we're recording now. I'm going to count us in. In five, four, three, two, one. Hello and welcome to USA Today's Five Things Evening Edition. I'm James Brown. Thanks for listening. In the evenings, we slow things down a bit to tackle big ideas with interesting people like today's guest, Jonathan English. You can find him on Twitter at EnglishRail. As his handle hints at, his specialty is transit. Jonathan English, welcome to Five Things.
Well, hello, and thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being here.
My pleasure.
You're a policy director at the Toronto Region Board of Trade. Give us a sense of what you do there.
So yeah, I actually do a couple different things. I'm at the Toronto Region Board of Trade. I'm also a fellow at Marin at NYU in New York. So the two very different places. But at the Board of Trade, I write reports. I look at the big problems that are facing the city in terms of transportation and infrastructure, and try to work to bring people together and work out solutions to them.
You split time between New York and Toronto?
Well, so I have a foot still in a bit the academic world, and I try to write and publish papers as well on different topics. Like I published relatively recently on the Northeast Corridor Improvement Project, which was a project in the 1970s in the Northeast from Boston to Washington.
Right. You've made a career in part by analyzing American transit, in particular New York system. What's the appeal?
Well, it's interesting, right? I don't know. I like things to some extent. I like things that are old. I'm by instinct a historian, and to some extent by training as well. And I like that when you're talking about transportation infrastructure, like rail transportation infrastructure, the stuff in the U.S. has maybe not quite as long as, say, Britain, but it's been around for a lot longer than most places. And because of that, it's gone through multiple historical cycles. A subway that was built in 1995 is still basically new, and it hasn't changed much. So there isn't that much of a story to tell there. There might be a little bit about how it was built, whatever, but a subway like the one in New York, it's been around for well over 100 years. If you count the elevated, it was around in the 19th century. And because of that, first of all, so much has changed around it. It has shaped the city and how the city works in so many different ways, how the city looks. And also there are all these just kind of interesting legacy things of bits of infrastructure that were sort of patched together, things that were repaired, things that had declined and have since revived and maybe declined again. And then also stuff which I do love, I must admit, that was never built. Like in New York, for example, there are all these stations in the subway where there are, whether they're full on, you call them ghost stations or sections of station that were built in anticipation of another subway that was going to be built but never was. So that's what makes it interesting. But I think from a scholarship standpoint, what really matters is that it tells us about where we might be going, where other places might be going, and history doesn't, it's fair enough, repeat itself, but it certainly has lessons to provide us. And the struggles that the New York City subway had as it started to get old, we're seeing those same struggles in cities like Washington, in cities like San Francisco, where the system's starting to age, and we have to think about it differently and rebuild it, in some cases almost from the ground up, the way that to get it working again as well as it did when it was new. And also the way that New York just stopped building, and that's been kind of an American issue to some extent. New York built one of the biggest subway systems in the world in about 40 years, which is really fast. We think that Chinese cities build fast today. They do, but New York built just as quickly in the 10s and 20s into the 30s. But then it just stopped. and they built almost nothing since then. Tiny little bits here and there. And understanding why that happened and maybe how that could be reversed is, I think, really important. So that's a long answer to why I'm interested, I guess.
Well, I want to touch on a couple of things that jump out at me from your response. You mentioned how subways and shape the city. I
Yeah.
would I would guess that comes from the fact that trains and subways in particular, but trains overall aren't very malleable. Once you kind of put down the track or build the
Mm,
tunnel, it's hard to move them.
that's right. Yeah, that's absolutely right. It's the permanence of rail that means that people know that they can build a building around it, and that rail's going to be there, for 50, 100 years, and that did prove to be the case. Maybe not always and everywhere, but when you're talking about big subways and that kind of big rail infrastructure um, in cities, it generally did stay in cities across the U.S. Streetcars and mainline railways in smaller towns, certainly lots of them did get abandoned, but the big stuff did generally stay. And one of the things that's amazing, there's some amazing photographs of the New York City subway that was literally built out into farm fields, just completely undeveloped farm fields. And it's it's sort of like when we build, even today, build expressways, but especially in the 70s and 60s, you just build an expressway out into farmland, and then within 5-10 years, all you could see to the horizon would be little houses, increasingly not so little houses. And in the earlier decades in cities like New York, it was the rails that did the same thing. You would build a subway out into farmland, and apartment houses would just sort of sprout up along them, like as if you're watering the ground and fertilizing the ground for or irrigating, I guess would be the best would be the best analogy. Um, and crops growing up around the irrigation ditch. The same is true with streetcars as well. Streetcar suburbs are a type of development that we take for granted, and we don't even realize that that's what they were. But if you look at Boston, was kind of the most famous, but all kinds of cities, whenever you see those sort of big long avenues with shops or the remnants of shops all along them, and then all the side streets branching off have sort of little houses. Generally speaking, those were along the streetcar lines. The shops were on the street with the streetcar, and then the houses all branched off those streets. So the way the country looks today, all the cities across the U.S. is broadly a reflection of the transportation infrastructure that was dominant when those parts of the city were built.
I had to stop there because you filled interesting vision in my mind. Apartments and houses being watered by transit. They're
Mm-hmm.
they're they're blossoming around the transit. I'm assuming that this
Yeah.
is not a uniquely American trait.
No, absolutely not. And if you go to Japan, for example, it's actually and this was actually true to some extent in the U.S. earlier on, but you still see private railway companies, or in some cases towns coming together, and or developers building a railway out to some plot of land that they own, so that they can redevelop it. And that's a fairly common process. Land is only valuable if you can get there. I mean, you can buy 2,000 acres of land or whatever in Alaska, but if there's no road to get to it, it doesn't really have much value. Maybe there's minerals or something that come with the title. You could get access to it, could have some value, but that's a different story. But in general, land's value comes from how accessible it is to other things. So if you own a plot of land in Midtown Manhattan, you're right next to hundreds and hundreds of thousands of highly paid workers. so it's a great place to build a store. So that land is very valuable. And why are there hundreds and hundreds of thousands of workers in Midtown Manhattan? Because there are railway lines, to some extent roads, but especially railway lines, subway and mainline rail, that all bring you into Midtown Manhattan. It's the most accessible place in the city, but you could argue in the country.
I want to touch on one more comment you made a moment or two ago. You talked about the struggles of aging transportation systems. Give me some examples. What is difficult? I would assume technology would be one.
Yeah.
Speed of rail.
Yeah. So, my little rule of thumb, approximately, just as a guide, is that a subway can last maybe 50, 60 years before it really starts to deteriorate a bit and needs additional maintenance and even full-on reconstruction. So the New York City subway, which was largely built in the 10s and 20s, really by the 60s to start, but especially by the 70s and into the 80s, it was in really, really rough shape. And there's been a multi-decade process to kind of bring it back to a state of good repair. If you go to the stations, they're not all the way there yet, but it certainly it functions better than it did in the 70s, generally speaking. Systems like Washington's Metro are also hitting that mark, depending on what line you're looking at, and they're starting to have some pretty serious issues. One thing that's interesting is that New York City subways technology, the original technology, it is from the 10s. It's mechanical. It's very physical technology. So in some ways it's quite rugged, but in other ways it's finicky and requires parts that have to be handmade, and those things make it challenging. Washington's Metro was really a technological showpiece when it was built, starting in the 1960s and for some years thereafter. It was quite a high-tech for its day system, but the problem is computers from the 1960s are, they're completely out of date, and so the technology has to be modernized. In some ways, that makes it even more complicated, because the New York City subway system, if you try to add new electronics to it, to some extent, and I'm oversimplifying here, but to some extent, you're starting from a blank slate. You're replacing these old mechanical technologies with computer technology. But in Washington, you have to upgrade the technology that already exists and has maybe starting to have some pretty serious problems. They've had some safety challenges there. And you have to do this, and this is the hard part, you have to do this while the system keeps running. You can't shut down a subway. There have been a couple cases where this has had to happen, and it's not good. It doesn't work well. You can't shut down a subway for 2 years to replace the signaling system. You have to do all this work while the trains are still running. And so that's difficult work. You often have to do it in the middle of the night. And it can be dangerous work to some extent, although we have safety procedures to make sure that it's as safe as possible. But most of all, it's disruptive work. You can't run the trains every 2 minutes if there's somebody working on the tracks. So you have to reduce schedules and shut down service sometimes, and that's disruptive to people, because just like you said, rail is permanent, so people build their lives around it, and people assume that they can always count on the subway to run past their house, and if suddenly it's not running, like when people were talking about the L train shutdown in Brooklyn, they plan their lives around being able to commute into Manhattan. Suddenly they're told that for 2 years they can't get to Manhattan, or they have to take a really roundabout route to get there. It completely changes your life, and you don't want to live there anymore. You don't go shopping there, or you don't go to restaurants in those neighborhoods anymore. And it's hard to get those people back after they have new patterns of life.
Are there any perfect or near perfect transit systems?
Well, this is sort of my joke. Everybody thinks that they have a terrible transit system. Everybody complains about their transit system at one time or another. It's just the degree of terrible is dependent on where you are. In some places it might be, oh, my transit system's terrible. The bus only comes 4 times a day, and it's that's pretty bad. You have to plan it doesn't run on Sundays. You're pretty it's a pretty hopeless situation if you have to rely on that system. But even if you're in Tokyo or a place like that, people will be upset because they expect the trains to be perfectly punctual and constantly running. And if there's any disruption or delay, that's intolerable. There are certainly systems that I think are pretty amazing. And I said Tokyo, and Tokyo's is, if you look at a map, because Tokyo has not just its subway or metro, actually it's 2 metros that are sort of connected, but they function separately. 2 metros, plus it has the JR, which is the national railway, but it actually functions like another subway system. And then on top of that, there are all these private railways, which, like I mentioned, were built out usually in the past to newly developing suburbs. And then the private railway at the station in the center of the city would build like a big office complex and department stores and stuff. So, all the people coming on their railway would then get funneled into their stores. And they've even done something amazing, which is that the commuter trains from these private railways in the outer parts, coming from the outer parts of the city, dive down into the subway and run through the subway and run out on some other private railway on the other side. Which is pretty amazing. Sometimes when you're down in the subway, you'll see like a mainline express train just running through the subway. And the way that they're able to time that, the punctuality, they're able to have express and local services even with only 2 tracks. And just the sheer scale of it, it's incredible. But Tokyo is an enormous city, so that's part of why the system is so impressive. I would say Berlin. I lived in Berlin for a while. If you ask Berliners, they think the system has all kinds of problems, but Berlin and maybe also Munich have very impressive, less wildly impressive than Tokyo, but they're quite comprehensive. They're reliable. They're easy to navigate. The signage is quite good. They have different modes that all work well together. You use one ticket for everything from, even if you took the national railway right down to the bus, it's all the same ticket. They have a ring railway around the whole city, which is really useful if you're not trying to, if you're going from sort of one outlying neighborhood to another. And it's also just really cool because it was, of course, chopped in 2 when the Berlin Wall was up. So they've stitched it back together again over the last 30 years, and now it functions more or less seamlessly. Even crazier was when the wall was up. Some of the subways would run from one part of the west to the other under the east. So these trains would run through the east without stopping, and there were armed border guards sitting in the abandoned stations under the east, who would keep you from keep Easterners from sort of, I don't know, going down and climbing onto one of the trains and riding out to the west. There was even a railway line that 2 lines from the west that intersected at a station in the middle of East Berlin. So if you were a West Berliner, you could take the train into East Berlin and change trains in the middle of East Berlin, but with a wall around you, and you couldn't get out of the station. And obviously it was more so that East Berliners couldn't get in. But anyway, it's just such an interesting system historically, and it functions quite well, and it's very comprehensive. You can get basically anywhere you want to go. So it's maybe not the perfect system, but it's maybe my favorite. Paris is also very impressive. There are other cities with some really cool systems. Seoul is very impressive, and they're expanding a lot.
Boy, that Berlin system, I could do a show just on that alone. I mean,
really,
that's fascinating.
It's really cool. I mean, if you don't mind, I can. There are other stories too, like the railway in the S-Bahn, it's called. It's sort of like a commuter railway, but really it's more like a subway. It's complicated. Was even in when the wall was up, the West West Berlin S-Bahn was actually operated by the East German government. So they had to have very reliable drivers who would not, defect. So you had to be quite, well vetted, and people, increasingly as tensions would go up, and West Berliners didn't really want to give money to the East by paying their fare on the train. So they were even talking about, and these plans were abandoned after the wall came down, of course, but they were even talking about building parallel subways so that people could ride sort of a West Berlin train as opposed to an East German train, which is a lot of money to solve a political problem, but they didn't end up having to do it. But there are a couple interesting ghost stations that were built as part of this plan.
So they got a bit far on their idea. At least they went as far as to build an actual station.
Yeah, they did. Yeah. So nobody saw the wall coming. In 1985, if you had told people that the Berlin Wall was going to come down in 1989, they would have very happily taken your bet. Let's just say that.
All right, taking all that into account, what's a bad transit system like?
Well, it's sort of what I think it's what I said before. So I think that's the thing. When people talk about transit systems in abstract, they often talk about infrastructure, physical infrastructure, trains and railway lines and bridges and tunnels and that kind of thing. But really what matters fundamentally for transit is the service. It doesn't matter how impressive your physical infrastructure is if the train only comes once an hour, or doesn't run on weekends, or doesn't run outside rush hour, which is true of many, many, many transit systems, especially in the U.S. There are a lot of people, who live in places, and I'm not talking small towns. These are big cities where the transit doesn't run on Sunday, where it doesn't run after 7 p.m. Like if you work at a mall, the mall doesn't close at 7 p.m. You're not going to be able to get home from work. If you go for drinks with your coworkers, even if you work 9 to 5, you might miss the last bus home. And that really, really limits people's lives. But it also means that nobody just about takes transit if they have an alternative. And it locks people out of all kinds of opportunities. You'll have a company in one part of the city that is desperate for workers, and a person who desperately wants a new job, but they can't take the job because they can't get there by transit, and maybe they can't afford a car or can't drive a car for whatever reason. So I would say those are the systems that have the biggest problems. Yeah, it's the case in far too many parts of the U.S. where you either can't rely on transit, or it runs so infrequently that you really have to plan your life around it. And good luck if you have to change buses, from one bus to the other. You might be standing on some forlorn street corner waiting for your connection for an hour, and that's completely impractical.
You mentioned buses. Is it possible to have a highly functioning transit system that isn't train based?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. You know, in a small to medium sized city, you don't even need really much physical infrastructure as long as you run the buses often, ideally ideally every 15 minutes, so you can, or even 10 minutes, so you can just show up and not have to worry about a timetable. But I recognize that in some places that's impractical. But every 30 minutes, that's just sort of a bare minimum, as long as it's all day, every day till midnight, or even a bit later. That's a perfectly adequate transit system that people can use reliably. One issue, and even in places, in South America, actually, they use buses especially a lot for even big city transit. They have these bus roadways that a bus comes every 5 seconds basically along these bus roadways, and they have these huge big stations. So buses can be used for even high density transit. I think where you start to run into issues is you look at an American city on a map. and compare it to a city in many other parts of the world of similar size, and they're just so much bigger physically. We live in bigger homes. This is sort of the North American way, Australia too, a few other places. We live in big houses on big lots, generally speaking. And because of that, the cities are much more spread out. It's also where people work that's more spread out as well. And you were not necessarily going to be able to escape that anytime soon. We're not going to tear down all of our cities and rebuild them from scratch to look like Tokyo. So we have to some extent, adapt transit to the environment that we actually have if we're ever going to get people to use it. So that is probably going to be about running more buses more frequently. Express buses use the expressways that most American cities have to run quicker trips. The ideal system, I think, for a North American city is a good network, like a web of local buses that can take you everywhere relatively frequently. They might not be that fast, but you can get everywhere reliably. You know that wherever you are in the city, you'll be able to get on a bus. And then a few fast lines that get you across the city quickly. Even something as simple as one going north-south, one going east-west. But the idea would be you take the local bus to this fast route, whether it's a busway, whether it's a train on a mainline railway that comes often all the time, or a subway or a fast LRT, to be able to get across the city quickly, and then you can take another bus to get to your final destination. Is it going to be super fast? No, but as long as that crosstown route is itself really quick, it's going to be reasonable. It's not going to be completely unreasonable. And one of the challenges is that, you look at a city like LA, they've built a lot of, the Gold Line, for example, goes to Pasadena from downtown. The problem is that it takes quite a while. And so if you have to get to downtown first and then get from Pasadena to wherever you're actually going, you're talking a really long journey. And that's one of the phenomena we've seen, is that people's average commute times over the years have always been at most about an hour. Now, that's not to say that some people don't commute much more than an hour round trip. But the average, generally speaking, sticks around an hour. And that's how we can see, I wrote an article about this once, that's how we can see, and one person came up with that idea, his name was Marchetti, but a few others have had a similar idea. But that's how cities have exploded in size. So you look at a medieval city, it's only as big as you can walk in about a half an hour, in every direction. So people lived in incredibly crowded conditions, and then, and that persisted, just about until the 19th century when trains and streetcars started to exist. And then when they were trains, they were fast, but they weren't all that high capacity, so they were expensive. So what you got was, in places like London, wealthier people, sort of middle to upper middle class people, would move out into these towns. Philadelphia is the same, the main line towns, which are still pretty wealthy suburbs along the main line. Wealthier people would move out, but lower income people still had to be close to work because they couldn't afford a train ticket. So they would live in super crowded places like the Lower East Side in New York. And then, by the sort of turn of the 20th century, cities started to build streetcars, yes, and then elevated trains and subway trains. So the Lower East Side, the people that lived in that neighborhood, moved across the river to Williamsburg and beyond, and that area stopped being 8 people to a room, and it started to become much less crowded, and eventually it became a super fashionable place to live, and people pay lots of money to live in the Lower East Side, and choose to live there rather than it being a place that people desperately tried to escape from. So and then when we started to build expressways, people could commute 30 miles in a half an hour. So suddenly the size of cities exploded, and because the area is squared, right? Like of a circle, pi r squared. The area of the city increased exponentially, and so you ended up having a much much bigger cities, but geographically speaking, but also much cheaper land. So people who used to have to live in a small apartment house could buy, a ranch bungalow on like a quarter-acre lot, even if they were, a relatively lower income person. Now, there were all kinds of barriers that prevented people moving into certain areas. Um, but from a purely economic standpoint, the different transportation technologies meant that cities could a lot of what it meant was that cities could grow, and therefore people could move into bigger places because they could move to where land is cheaper. Now, we haven't had any new transportation technologies really since the invention of the expressway, so that's part of the reason why housing prices are going up, because cities are still growing, but they can't really grow physically, especially if they're centralized cities, the way that they did in the 60s when new expressways allowed people to move onto farmland.
I was watching a live stream you participated in a few months ago on YouTube. You've I believe it's RM Transit, if I'm remembering
Oh,
the
yes. Okay.
name.
Yeah.
You've been on there a
Yeah.
few times,
Yes.
and you mentioned that you were surprised that when the Sixth Avenue train in New York City opened, that it wasn't treated like a big deal.
Yeah.
Like it was. I got the sense that from your description that people just expected that there would be more.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
What's
Absolutely.
changed? What does that say to you?
Yeah. No, that's a really, really good question, and it's true. I was going through the newspaper archives, and I looked on the day the Sixth Avenue subway opened, and it's a bit of a story, but it was sort of like a one-day story that didn't even make the front page, as I recall. And compare that, and the Sixth Avenue subway was a huge deal, like a pretty long, impressive system. When the Second Avenue subway opened, which after all is just three stops, and a renovated fourth one, it was sort of front page news for weeks. This was the sort of centerpiece of then Governor Cuomo's term in office. Just about, he was making it into a very big deal. This was a huge project. It's because there hadn't been much construction for decades, a few things here and there. And I did write an article on why New York City stopped building subways. So I think it is a bit of a complicated question. Part of it was that maintenance caught up with them, and the money that they had, the money that they had been spending on expanding the system, they started to spend on maintenance. Part of the problem was the shape of the city just changed. The growth wasn't happening. You couldn't build subways out onto farmland anymore and get this big time growth. Instead, the city itself was mostly built out. Queens was a bit of an exception, but most of the growth was happening along highways, and the transit system wasn't really adapted to this new world. There were railway lines that went out into these areas, and the Long Island Railroad, for example, became, it is now the busiest railroad in the United States, and has been for a long time because of all the commuters that live on Long Island. But it was never really tied into the subway system in a way that in European cities, for example, those historic mainline railways were kind of just tied right into the subway system. That's the S-Bahn that I mentioned in Berlin. So the subway kind of got detached from a big part of the region, the urban region, and I think that was a big problem. It was shocking, right? Like that's why they were building stations in anticipation of new expansions that were never built. The Second World War was more or less the dividing line. Obviously, when the Second World War happened, the countries, there were a few things that were still finished, but the country's resources were diverted to the war effort, and they weren't starting any new subway projects really. But then after the war ended, when they looked at the possibility of, okay, should we start building again? They said, well, no, we better spend the money on maintenance, basically, and getting the system back up to functioning. There was another story in New York specifically, which was that the railways were built, the subways were built by 3 companies, 2 of which were private. And the city spent an enormous amount of money buying out the private companies to bring them into public ownership. And a lot of the money that might have been able to be spent on subway expansion was spent on buying out those companies, which had gone bankrupt as a result of the depression and other things. So it was a lot of sort of contingent factors that led to New York suddenly stopping building subways. But it is obviously something that has happened in many, many cities where you build, and then suddenly, construction just drops off a cliff. And what's so interesting about it is it's not like Washington, where Washington knew exactly all the lines that they wanted to build. And when they finished building them, and they've added a bit here and there. But in general, that was the system that they wanted, and it was done, and they declared that it was completed. In New York, they had lots of plans, lots of additional plans, and just sort of one day it just stopped, and they stopped building them. And it was like, the people just sort of, it was as if people just sort of walked away and never went back to rebuilding. And it's been, it's going to be 100 years, or it's 80 years now, really, since most construction stopped, and it's never resumed. And most American cities too. You look at San Francisco, the BART system was massively was built in an incredibly short period of time, like a massive system. And since then, there have been some additions to it, but much smaller in scale. And the cost of construction, partly because we don't build as much, but also other reasons, has risen so much that you can't build nearly as much, even though the U.S. is a much wealthier country today than it was in the 1920s. The cost of construction has gone up even more, so that so it's not that affordable to build huge amounts. Interestingly, in other countries in the world, construction costs are much lower, and so they are able to build much more. And this isn't just about China. This is countries like Spain, France, South Korea.
What's the difference in the cost?
What's the difference in the number, or what's the cause of the difference?
Meaning overseas, they're still building these subways and above ground trains. They're not very common in America.
Yeah.
What's the difference cost wise? Is it the companies that are being used to build it? Is it the materials? Why are the costs of building trains overseas lower than it is train lines? Lower than it is here?
That's a very good, but also a very difficult question. And some of my colleagues at the Marin Institute at NYU have just completed something called the Transit Cost Project, which tries to answer some of these questions. But one of the things that they have concluded is that it's a complicated question. There isn't one single factor. When you would ask people in the past, why is it so much more expensive to build in the US than in other countries, they would sort of have one snap answer. Oh, it's unions, or it's corruption, or it's this and that, politics. And it's clear that it's not that simple at all. Obviously, American workers are paid a bit more than in some countries. That goes without saying, and that's a good thing. But that's not necessarily true everywhere, and it certainly doesn't come anywhere close to explaining why. Some of it is a lack of experience. Some of it is that it takes a very long time to get projects permitted in the U.S. That's a factor as well. We have an environmental protection process that was created to prevent building highways through a wetland or something, that is equally applied to a subway project that's actually going to reduce emissions, take cars off the road by any reasonable measure, reduce urban sprawl by any reasonable measure, help the environment. But it has to go through the same processes, to a certain extent, fairly enough, but those processes do take time. there are, there's a lot of of building. One of the things that's interesting is we tend to build using older technology. This is a generalization, I know, but in other parts of the world, these days, what we tend to see built most often are relatively short trains that are automatic, so they run very frequently. Because when you think about it, a train that's 3 cars long that runs every 2 minutes is going to have the same capacity as a train 6 cars long that runs every 4 minutes. And American trains using sort of older technology like the New York technology, the Second Avenue subway was just built, but it's built to hook into a line that was built in the 1920s. So it has big, long trains that don't actually run all that often. And so stations are the biggest cost of subway construction specifically. And when you have a longer train, you need a longer station. And that means you have to dig all the way down this huge box for the station. And so when you have a train that's twice as long, you need more than twice as much earth to be dug out to build the station, which massively increases the cost, and you need more ventilation and all kinds of other things. So to some extent, we're building things in maybe a bit of an older fashioned way. And again, that's a generalization. There are other factors as well. It is often blamed that the U.S. is especially tolerant of what people call "not in my backyard" objections, and the legal, NIMBYs. The legal process makes it easier for people to complain. So sometimes agencies, they don't want to get yelled at. The politicians don't want to get yelled at. The agency workers don't want to get yelled at. So in some cases, it's just easier to build a tunnel under these people's houses so they don't notice it, rather than running it, like you mentioned, an elevated train. Now, an elevated train might cost much less and allow us to build a lot more rapid transit in a city, but people will complain that it doesn't look nice, or maybe they can hear the noise. Modern trains are not like elevated trains in Chicago or New York from which were built in like the 19th century. In some cases, they are much quieter, but people don't necessarily want to wait to find that out, and so we have people saying things like, "No, I don't want this here." There's also build it somewhere else, or build it in a more expensive way. Only do construction work during daylight hours when I'm at work, so I'm not bothered at all. All these kinds of things add costs, and the cumulative effect of all of these different things means that a person, in Paris, which is again not a poor city, a city that has plenty of unions, a city that has very strong safety and environmental regulations, it's still up to 20%, 30% cheaper to build. Pardon me, more than that. That's other places. It's up to 5 times more expensive, in some cases 10 times more expensive, to build in the United States the same kind of project as it is in a city like Paris or Madrid.
Because of the phone there, would you mind repeating that once more?
Sure.
So I'll give you a prompt.
Yep.
Comparing the prices of building trains in an American city versus someplace like Paris, what kind of difference are we looking at in terms of cost?
So the difference can be as much as 10 times, depending on the project. So 10 times more expensive to build the same thing in a US city as in a city like Paris, which also has very strong regulations and processes to keep people safe. So understandably, when you go to Europe and you see, oh, look at how impressive the trains are there, it's not necessarily that they're spending more than the United States is. It's that they can build 10 times as much for the same amount of money.
That's remarkable. I want to touch on a couple other issues, some that have been in the news recently. There have been several major train wrecks recently. Obviously, those wrecks weren't passenger trains,
Mm-hmm.
but it does bring to mind train safety.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the safety concerns around trains?
Well, so I'll preface this by saying that the train is basically the safest way to travel. There's pretty much no way of travel that is safer than the train, other than maybe an elevator. But there are still differences in safety between different systems. In Japan, they take enormous pride that the Shinkansen, they're bullet trains that run across the country at very high speeds. They have moved billions upon billions of people since they opened in the 1960s. The trains run every 2 minutes. They've never had a single fatality on that system in the decades and decades that it's operated. And
Wow.
Japan has crazy earthquakes and like all kinds of calamities that happen in that country. But they've never had a single fatality because they're really, 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 really careful with their safety processes. In the US, partly because like I said, you don't have trains running every 2 minutes, the density of use is lower. The practices we use are often, around signaling are often much more manual. They can literally be on a less used line, as simple as a guy calling on the cell phone to the dispatcher saying, okay, I'm moving past this place now, make sure the track is clear. Then the dispatcher will call the other driver on the cell phone and, okay, don't go here, stop here, pull into this siding. And so understandably, this just leaves more room for human error. It does leave more room for human error. And there has been an increasing regulatory push, and this is has now basically been implemented for what's called positive train control on lines that have especially passenger traffic. So a central system should know where the trains are and be able to stop them if they're going someplace they shouldn't. But still, the systems are much less sophisticated than the ones used in other places or in really high density environments. So that is, the most sophisticated signaling systems know exactly where the train is to the centimeter almost, and knows where all the trains are on the system, and how fast they're going, obviously which direction they're going, how heavy they are, because that affects the stopping distance. And all these things are computed centrally, and so trains are routed in ways that are precisely calibrated to maximize safety. But those systems are in widespread use around the world and are being used more and more frequently. Those systems are not yet in place in most of the American rail network. That's not to say that it's not a safe system. And when you're only running a few trains a day, as is the case on many lines in the US, branch lines especially, a system where you just say, okay, I'm on the line now is probably just fine. But that is still a factor. Also, the maintenance of tracks. They in Europe and Asia, they're often maintained to very, very tight tolerances because trains run really fast. In parts of the US, when you're just carrying a slow train full of coal, the coal doesn't really care if the ride is bumpy. So sometimes the maintenance doesn't have to be as stringent, but as a result, sometimes the rails can break a little bit more often, and then you can have a derailment. Most of the time, that doesn't lead to any negative consequences, really, other than a bit of a mess to clean up, not a non-toxic mess. But there are incidents where where there can be a toxic spill, and that's a bad thing, like we've seen.
This is a really broad question, but I'd love to hear your response. What would it take to significantly improve American infrastructure?
Well, I mean, I guess I think that the biggest problem is a combination of both a lack of money in some cases and the high cost of construction in the other case, right? Like, both of those things have to come together. And if you can solve both of those problems, then you truly can have a lot more. It's not that the U.S. isn't spending a lot. In some cases it is, but it is a big country. And so it takes a lot of money to build railway lines and other things in, over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles. I think the other thing is just focus on service, really focus on getting the service right. And that's critical, right? You can have the best infrastructure in the world, but if the buses or trains are only coming once an hour, the infrastructure isn't up to much. So in many ways, the US often has really good infrastructure. The infrastructure in Philadelphia, for example, isn't all that much different from the infrastructure in Berlin. It's very impressive. It's just that the trains don't run nearly as often. And fare policies mean that lots of people can't use the trains because they can't afford the high fare for the regional train. Like, all kinds of those soft issues, if you want to call them, are in many cases what's holding us back more than even the physical infrastructure.
Also, I want to take advantage of your Canadian residence, or at least having one foot in both worlds, right?
Exactly.
Let's look at the American approach to mass transit, and let's look at the Canadian approach to mass transit. Can you compare and contrast the two?
Well, so I think that the biggest difference is on that service side. It really is on that service side. There are far more places where buses run every 15 minutes, at least every 30 minutes, even in smaller cities. In the big cities, often the buses come every 5 minutes or more. And this is true even in suburbia. That is just not the case in most of the United States. Even in New York City, where I lived, this is, in Brooklyn, like where the population density is incredibly high. Some of the buses would come every half an hour. In a neighborhood like that, in a Canadian city, generally speaking, that just wouldn't happen. And certainly if you go to other cities in the US or suburbs, you'll have buses a few times a day. And while that does happen sometimes in Canadian cities, it's much rarer. So I wouldn't say the Canadian infrastructure, generally speaking, is that much better. It's more the service is more frequent.
One of the common pieces of commentary among the COVID-19 pandemic is that people wanted to get away from public transit. They were trying to get out of dense areas. What do you expect the lingering effects of that, if any, will be?
Well, I think it's hard to say, right? Will people go back to the offices, or will the offices fill up with different people, different kinds of jobs in the long term? Probably. And so those commuters will maybe to some extent come back. But I think the big picture is that transit has to adapt to a new world. Transit has to adapt to a world in which the growth is going to come overwhelmingly or entirely outside the traditional rush hour. And too many transit agencies are focused entirely on the 9 to 5, Monday to Friday commuter market. And that market isn't anywhere close to what it used to be and might never come back. So if transit is going to succeed and continue to be useful for people, serving the essential workers that we all credited during the height of the pandemic, the people that really do have to commute to a physical workplace, that is going to be the real challenge of transit systems in the next decade or more. Adapting, and that, again, that's a service question, right? It's running trains and buses all day rather than just at rush hour, running them in both directions, not just commuting to downtown. Like those kinds of things, I think that's the path out of COVID for transit, and it's the path out of stagnation for cities, because you can't build new highway infrastructure, generally speaking. It's there just isn't the room. So transit is the only way that cities can continue to grow. So they have to, it's not to say that people are going to all stop driving, but for them to grow, it's going to have to be through transit.
Any famous last words?
No, I think I think I've covered just about everything. I think, but yeah, big picture, focus on service. The history of transportation and infrastructure is super interesting, and I encourage people to dig into it more. And I think transportation really shaped the way that we live today, and we maybe take it for granted, but everywhere you look around you, it's largely been shaped by transportation. And the choices we make about transportation infrastructure and service, what we build, is going to shape the city of the future.
I'd love to learn more sometime down the road.
Thank you.
Jonathan
very
English, thanks for joining me.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me. Cheers.
Yeah. And thank you for humoring me and my many questions for you. I have more. I actually didn't get to them all.
Hey, well, you can have me on again if you like. I really enjoyed it.
I'd love to. Shannon, I know I went way long.
No.
But I thought you were fascinating.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
I appreciate it. I really appreciate it. And thank great questions. And I really enjoyed the discussion. So thank you.
Yeah. Well, we'll definitely chat down the road.
I'm going to hit end recording.
Okay.
Yeah.